It's almost eerie, isn't it? We create these materials, plastics designed to last for ages, and yet, well, they're breaking down into these microscopic pieces that are showing up everywhere, especially in our water.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
We're talking about microplastics, of course. And the huge question is, how are they getting into our aquatic environments in such, well, significant numbers?
Right.
Well, while we often think of obvious sources like plastic litter, a really critical pathway is through the treated water that comes out of our municipal wastewater treatment plants, WWTPs, you know.
Oh, the treatment plant.
Exactly. These plants are vital for cleaning our water before it's released back into the environment, but I mean, they weren't originally designed to handle these tiny plastic particles.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Today, we're diving deep into a really fascinating and comprehensive study that took place across South Korea.
Oh, okay.
We've got this research paper, Nationwide Evaluation of Microplastic Properties in Municipal Wastewater Treatment Plants in South Korea. It was published in Environmental Pollution.
Right, I've seen that one. It's a big piece of work, isn't it?
It is. It looked at 22 different WTPs all over the country. So our mission really is to understand just how well these plants are doing at removing microplastics, what these tiny pollutants are actually like.
Their characteristics.
Exactly, and what the implications are for the health of our rivers and streams. By the end of this, you'll have a much clearer picture of this complex issue and maybe even a few surprising facts to share.
Sounds good. So let's get right to the headline then. What did this nationwide evaluation find? How effective are these South Korean plants at actually getting rid of microplastics?
Well, the headline is actually quite impressive on the surface. The study found a very high average microplastic removal rate, over 99%.
Over 99%. Wow, that sounds pretty good.
It sounds like a major win, right? So 99% sounds great, but here's a sort of mind-bending detail we'll get into. The study actually found more microplastics in some of the initial stages of treatment.
Wait, more. Okay, we definitely need to come back to that.
Mm-hmm.
But focusing on the overall removal first.
Yes, the overall
That
fact.
99% figure. The researchers identified sedimentation, specifically in the second clarifier, which is a standard part of how these plants work, as the main reason for this high removal.
Sedimentation. So basically just letting the heavier stuff settle out of the water.
That's the core idea, yeah. Letting particles settle.
Interesting. So you'd think maybe the specific technology a plant uses to clean the water would make a big difference in catching these tiny plastics, but the study suggests maybe not so much.
That's a key insight, yeah. Because the majority of the 22 plants they looked at used this second clarifier step. The overall removal efficiency was pretty consistent. It didn't seem to matter too much what other specific, say, biological treatment technologies they had in place before that.
Okay.
However, it is important to mention that the plants that had an extra step, what's called tertiary treatment, they did show even better microplastic removal compared to those that only went up to secondary treatment.
Right, an extra polishing step. Okay, so 99% removal sounds fantastic, but I'm sensing a but coming. Because if it's 99%, why are we still so concerned? I mean, is that remaining 1% really that significant?
You're absolutely right to ask that. Here's where it gets, well, really interesting, or maybe worrying. Even with that very high removal percentage, the sheer amount of wastewater that's treated and then discharged every single day.
Oh, the volume.
Exactly. The sheer volume means that a substantial quantity of microplastics is still finding its way into the environment.
Okay, can you put some numbers on that substantial quantity? What are we talking about?
Sure. The study estimates that the treated water, the effluent, as it's called, coming out of these WWTPs, could increase the levels of microplastics in the rivers and streams that receive it by anywhere from about, say, 6 to over 270 items per cubic meter.
Whoa, 6 to 270. It's a huge variation. What could account for such a massive difference between plants?
That's a great question. It likely depends on the initial concentration coming in, the specific flow rate of the plant, maybe even the characteristics of the receiving water body itself. Lots of factors.
Okay. And how does that range, that 6 to 270 items, compare to the levels of microplastics that are already out there in Korean streams?
Well, that's the crucial context, isn't it? Previous research in South Korea found microplastic levels in streams ranging from about 1 to 234 items per cubic meter.
Ah, so in some cases, the discharge from these wastewater plants could potentially double or even more than double the existing microplastic concentration in those waters.
That's the potential impact, yes. It certainly puts that 99% removal rate into a different light.
It really does. It's like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a very efficient thimble, maybe, the leak is just massive.
That's a good analogy. It's also important to keep in mind, as the study notes, that the receding waters they looked at were mostly smaller tributaries. The impact on larger rivers might be different, perhaps diluted more.
Right, dilution could play a role.
But the potential for significant local increases in microplastic pollution is definitely there.
Okay. So, even though a lot is being caught, a significant amount is still escaping. This naturally leads us to wonder, what exactly are these tiny particles that are making it through? Let's talk about their characteristics. Shape, for instance.
Good question. The study found that the vast majority of the microplastics they detected were either fragments, little broken bits and pieces, or fibers, those tiny threads.
Oh.
On average, fragments made up about 77% in the water coming into the plant, the influent, and actually increased to nearly 85% in the treated water going out the effluent. Fibers were the other main shape.
Fragments increased. Interesting. So mostly bits and fibers. That fits with what I've read. Lots of little pieces, and those tiny threads we know come from, say, washing our clothes.
Exactly.
But, I've often heard that fibers are supposed to be harder to remove because of their shape. They don't settle as easily, perhaps. Did the study back that up?
Surprisingly, no. This was another one of those unexpected findings. The removal rates for both fragments and fibers were actually very similar, both around 99.6% to 99.7%.
Really? That's similar.
Yeah. And even more counterintuitively, as I mentioned, the proportion of fragments actually increased in the effluent compared to the influent.
So what could be causing that?
Well, the researchers suggest that maybe some larger plastic items are breaking down into smaller fragments during the treatment process itself. Or there could be other complex factors at play, maybe related to how they interact with sludge.
Huh. That's definitely not what I would have guessed.
Okay, what about the actual stuff these microplastics are made of? What types of plastic are we talking about?
Just another really interesting area. The most commonly detected type of plastic was, get this, polytetrafluoroethylene. PTFE.
PTFE, wait, isn't that
Teflon?
Teflon, like the coating on nonstick pans?
That's the one. It made up about 46.5% of the microplastics in the effluent, and even more, 56.5% in the effluent. Wow. Teflon in wastewater. How does that happen? I mean, are our pans shedding that much? Or could there be other reasons why PTFE seems so, prevalent here?
That's exactly the question the researchers tackled. They point to a likely reason related to how they actually found the microplastics in the lab.
The methodology.
Right. They used a solution called zinc bromide for density separation. This stuff is very dense, much heavier than the saltwater solution often used in other studies.
Okay.
And because PTFE is also quite dense, quite heavy for a plastic, it floats better in this super dense zinc bromide solution.
Yeah.
This makes it easier to separate and detect compared to lighter plastics.
So other studies using, say, saltwater might have just missed a lot of the PTFE.
That's the hypothesis.
Yeah.
And it actually lines up with other research in South Korea that also used similar heavy liquids and also found high levels of PTFE, not just in water, but even in fish.
Fascinating. It really highlights how the methods scientists use can really influence what they discover, doesn't it?
Absolutely critical point. You might only find what your method allows you to see.
So besides the surprising amount of PTFE, what were the other common types of plastic they found?
Well, after PTFE, the next most common was polyester, or PES. That made up about 24% in the effluent, but it dropped quite a bit to around 13% in the effluent.
Polyester.
Yeah.
Thinking close again.
That's the likely source,
Yeah.
Laundry. Those tiny fibers we were talking about. Then came polypropylene, PP, which was around 15% coming in and actually increased to 21% going out.
PP increased too, like fragments. Interesting.
And polyethylene, PE, was about 7% in the influent and 5% in the effluent. So PTFE, PES, PP, and PE were the main players.
Okay, that makes sense with packaging and textiles and things. Now let's talk size. We know they're micro, but how big or maybe how small were these particles typically?
They were really small. The vast majority, over 70% of the microplastics found in these WWTPs, were smaller than 300 micrometers.
300 micrometers. Can you give us a sense of scale?
Sure. A typical human hair is around 70 to 100 micrometers thick. So we're talking about particles mostly just a few hair widths across or even smaller. Very tiny. The average size they measured was around 245 micrometers in the influent and actually a little larger, around the 321 micrometers in the effluent.
Larger in the effluent. That seems odd too.
It does. Perhaps smaller particles are removed slightly more effectively, or maybe it relates back to that fragmentation idea, creating some slightly larger fragments from initially bigger pieces. It's complex.
So even though microplastics are technically defined as anything smaller than 5 millimeters, The real issue, it seems, or at least the most numerous particles, are these much, much smaller ones, under 300 microns.
That seems to be the case, yes.
What does that tell us about where we should be focusing our control efforts in these plants?
It strongly suggests that when we think about improving microplastic control in WWTPs, we really need technologies or processes that can effectively capture this smaller size range, the sub-300 micrometer particles.
Because those are the ones most likely to be ingested by tiny organisms.
Exactly. They can enter the base of the food web more easily. Though interestingly, while most were under 300 micrometers, the study did see a noticeable increase in the proportion of slightly larger particles, in the 300 to 5,000 micrometer range, in the treated water compared to the untreated water.
Another hint towards fragmentation during treatment, maybe.
Could be. It paints a really detailed picture of what's coming in and going out.
It really does. Now, I'm curious about what happens inside the treatment process itself. You mentioned the stages earlier. Where are these microplastics actually going during treatment?
Right. So a typical plant, as we said, has primary treatment grit chambers, primary clarifiers for settling. Then secondary treatment, usually biological processes with microbes breaking down waste, followed by that crucial second clarifier for more settling.
And sometimes tertiary treatment for extra purification.
Correct. And the study looked at the levels of microplastics at each of these stages.
And the findings were surprising.
Yes, some were quite unexpected, as we touched on earlier. They actually saw an increase in the measured concentration of microplastics in the primary treatment stage.
An increase?
Yeah, but 110% increase compared to the raw water coming into the plant.
Wait, that's wild. So the first steps, designed to remove stuff, are actually making the microplastic problem seem worse, at least concentration-wise. How does that work?
The researchers think it's because most of the microplastics they found were much smaller than the openings in the screens of the grit chambers.
Yeah.
Those screens are usually designed to catch bigger things, like over 1 millimeter.
So the plastics just slip through.
Right. And the first settling tank, the primary clarifier, is really designed for heavier particles like sand and organic solids, not these relatively light microplastics, which might not settle out quickly there.
Okay.
So they're essentially passing right through primary treatment, and maybe they become more concentrated in the water sample as some of the other larger, heavier stuff is removed.
Ah, okay, that makes a bit more sense. It's a relative concentration effect. What happens next in the biological stage?
Well, brace yourself. In the biological treatment stage, they saw an even larger apparent increase, about 244% compared to the initial influent water.
Whoa. 244%. Where are all these extra plastics coming from?
The researchers hypothesized this could be because of the return of what's called activated sludge from the second clarifier back to the bioreactor tank.
Activated sludge. Oh. That's the microbial soup that eats the waste.
Exactly. And that sludge, which settles out in the second clarifier, contains the microplastics that were removed there. But some of that sludge is often recycled back to the biological stage to keep the microbes happy.
So it's like the plant is temporarily holding on to these microplastics in the sludge, settling them out, but then sending some of them back to an earlier stage.
That seems to be what's happening, yes. It concentrates them within the system. But then comes the big drop in that second clarifier.
The sedimentation step we talked about.
Right. There, they found a massive decrease, a 99.75% removal of microplastics within that single step.
Wow, okay.
This really highlights that letting things settle in that second tank is, by far, the most effective way the current plants are capturing these particles. It's likely helped by the microplastics sticking to, or getting trapped within, the clumps of activated sludge as they settle.
So the second settling tank is the real workhorse here for microplastic removal, even if some get recycled temporarily.
Definitely seems that way based on this study.
And what about that extra tertiary treatment we mentioned earlier, the polishing step?
They found a further reduction in microplastics in the tertiary stage, about 51% less compared to what was in the water after the second clarifier.
So it does remove more.
It does. But because so much was already removed by the second clarifier, this additional 51% reduction only translated to a modest 0.12% increase in the overall plant removal efficiency compared to just having secondary treatment.
Oh, okay. So tertiary helps, but the heavy lifting is done in that secondary settling phase?
Precisely. It sounds like the current infrastructure, while, not specifically designed to catch microplastics, is doing a pretty decent job somewhat by accident, mainly through that settling process.
Right. Now, the study also looked at whether the levels of microplastics were linked to other things, like how polluted the water was generally or the population size, right?
They did. They checked if the amount of microplastics in the treated water going out, the effluent, was related to factors like the population the plant serves, the total organic carbon, TOC, and total suspended solids, TSS.
And were they related? More pollution meaning more microplastics.
Surprisingly, they didn't find any strong positive connections. The statistical measures they used, the R-squared values, which show correlation, they were very low for all of them, less than 0.08. So almost no correlation detected in the effluent.
That's interesting because I feel like I've seen other studies suggesting those kinds of connections, like more people equals more microplastics. Why might this study have found different results?
Well, the researchers suggested because they were mainly looking at the treated water, the effluent, the cleaning processes themselves might be masking or removing any relationships that might exist in the untreated water coming into the plant.
Ah, the treatment process kind of levels the playing field.
But potentially, yeah. They even found a slight negative connection between the population served by a plant and the amount of microplastics in its influent, the incoming water, which is quite complicated.
Negative, more people, fewer microplastics coming in. That doesn't seem right.
It's puzzling, right? It suggests that many other things are influencing the amount of microplastics entering the system. Maybe things like the presence of specific local industries, or different patterns of water use, or maybe even how effectively street runoff is captured or not captured by the sewer system in different areas. It's clearly not as simple as just saying more people automatically means more microplastics in the wastewater inflow.
Okay, so lots of factors at the source. The study also looked at seasonality, didn't it? Thinking about things like maybe more synthetic clothes laundry in the winter leading to more fibers, or heavy rainfall washing more stuff into the system. That seems logical. Did they find any seasonal patterns?
You'd think so. But another surprise. In the 4 plants they monitored closely over time, sampling 6 times across the seasons, they didn't find any clear, discernible patterns. Not in the total amount of microplastics, nor in their characteristics, like the proportion of fibers versus fragments.
No seasonal difference at all.
Not that they could reliably detect, even specific rainfall events didn't seem to consistently change the levels coming into the plants. And maybe just as importantly, the overall removal efficiency of the plants also stayed pretty consistent throughout the year. The standard deviations were less than 1%.
That's quite unexpected. I really would have thought winter laundry habits alone might have increased the number of fibers they found, for example.
Indeed. The researchers acknowledge that while some other, perhaps smaller scale or differently focused studies have reported seeing seasonal variations, like more fibers in winter, they didn't find that clear signal in this nationwide look across multiple plants.
It really highlights how complex this issue is and maybe how localized factors can play a big role that gets averaged out in a bigger study.
Exactly. It suggests we probably need more focused, maybe local studies to really understand those kinds of variations and influencing factors.
Okay, so let's try and bring it all together. What are the main things we, and you, the listener, should take away from this deep dive into South Korea's microplastic situation in their wastewater treatment plants?
Well, the big picture is, I think, twofold. First, the wastewater treatment plants in South Korea are actually very good, remarkably efficient on a percentage basis at removing microplastics over 99% on average. And this seems to happen mainly because of the settling process in the second clarifier.
Okay, high efficiency through settling. What's the second part?
The second part is the but. But because of the enormous volumes of water these plants treat every day, even that tiny percentage getting through adds up to a significant quantity of microplastics still being released into rivers and streams.
Right, the volume issue.
And we also learned that the most common type of microplastic they found were these small fragments, often less than 300 micrometers. And surprisingly, PTFE, or Teflon, was the most common material identified, likely because of the specific dense liquid they used for detection.
Got it. And what were some of the more surprising, maybe counterintuitive findings?
I'd say definitely the fact that the measured concentration of microplastics actually seemed to increase during the initial primary and biological treatment stages. That was unexpected.
Yeah, that was weird.
Also, the fact that different shapes of microplastics like fragments and fibers, which you might think behave differently, were actually removed at very similar high rates.
Right, the fiber removal wasn't lower.
And then the lack of strong connections between microplastic levels in the effluent and typical measures of water pollution like TOC or TSS or the population size, and also the lack of clear seasonal patterns. These findings really show us how complicated it is to track and understand how microplastics behave in these complex treatment systems.
This has been incredibly insightful. It really highlights that even when removal rates seem impressively high, the total environmental impact can still be significant just due to scale.
Absolutely.
So, given all this, what's the big question we should be asking ourselves now? We started by thinking about how this seemingly indestructible material, plastic, ends up as these invisible threats in our water. This deep dive has shown us the incredible effort going into capturing them at wastewater plants.
Doing a better job than we might have thought in some ways.
Right. But yet, the sheer scale of the problem means those invisible threats are still finding their way back into our environment day after day. It's a sobering thought, really.
It is. And this research raises a really important question, I think, for all of us. Given that we're seeing so many of these very small particles, and that even highly efficient current wastewater treatment plants have these limitations we've discussed, what are the most effective ways forward to further reduce microplastic pollution from our wastewater?
Where should the focus be?
Exactly. Should we be focusing more, perhaps, on preventing microplastics from entering the wastewater stream in the first place? Things like better filters in washing machines, or maybe changes in how products are designed and made?
Source control.
Right?
Okay.
Or do we need to double down on the treatment end? Do we need to invest more in optimizing or adding advanced tertiary treatment processes that are specifically designed to target these smaller particles more effectively?
A tricky balance, probably needing both.
Probably. And ultimately, we have to keep asking, what are the broader consequences of this ongoing discharge for the health of the ecosystems in our rivers, lakes, and oceans, and potentially down the line for our own health?
Some really crucial points to consider there. It's clear that while wastewater treatment plants are a vital part of the picture, they're not the whole solution. We probably need to think much more broadly, using a whole range of approaches, to really tackle this persistent problem.
Absolutely. And maybe we can encourage you, our listeners, to think more about this issue too. Consider your own potential contributions to minimizing microplastic pollution from, say, the types of clothes you buy and how you wash them, to how you handle plastic waste in general. Every little bit really can make a difference in protecting our precious water environments.